In this first lesson on EU law, we're going to be talking about the historical origins of the European Union and the general motivations behind further integration of member states of Europe. We're going to do this because I think it's foundational to really start to understand the legal principles within the EU, start to talk about things like the single market and and competition law and all these kind of things. It's important to understand the historical origins of the EU and how the European Union developed. So we're starting to look at development of the European Union. So development generally from its foundations with the EEC Treaty, all the way up coming to things like the Lisbon Treaty in the 2000s. So we're going to begin by briefly examining the real foundational document within EU law, and we're going to and then we'll take a step back, have a look at the context of the EEC Treaty within a treaty that was established slightly earlier than the EEC Treaty, and then we're going to start to bring back and start to examine the Treaty of Rome specifically. So I should just note here that the EEC stands for European Economic Community, okay, and we are talking about this being established by the Treaty of Rome. So if I'm talking about the EEC Treaty, they're indistinguishable from the Treaty of Rome. So Treaty of Rome, EEC Treaty. Okay, just so, because if I start to use them interchangeably and people start to get confused, then I'm going to get people in the comments asking questions. So the Treaty of Rome was signed by these states here. They were signed by France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg. And this was done in 1957. And the general motivation for the Treaty of Rome was to, quote, lay the foundations of an ever closer union among the peoples of Europe. And this is, this is the general motivation of the European Union as a whole, effectively. So, motivation of the EU as a whole. So when we start to look at the historical origins of the European Union, and we start to look at its development through the years, start keep in the back of your mind that the concept of ever closer union among the peoples of Europe, the concept of European integration. So this is really what a lot of the key features of the European Union are trying to achieve: a further integration of member states in Europe. So ultimately, the motivation for further European integration came at the end of World War II. So World War II happened between 39 and 45. It was the most destructive single armed conflict in all of human history. And there was a desire following this, effectively this destruction of Europe. There was a desire to try and seek greater political and economic integration, on the pretense that this would make peace more likely. So this would ensure peace. And because because if European nations were more economically integrated, they would have to rely on each other more for economic prosperity, which made it difficult for them to go to war. If you're relying, for example, on a different country for imports of a number of very important resources, it's probably not a wise idea to then go and bomb that country and try and destroy that country, because then you're going to have limited access to those resources. That's a very basic understanding of the general motivation towards further integration. The EEC Treaty established what we call a common market to promote economic integration, and we're going to talk a lot about the common market as we go on through the lessons, and we're going to talk about how the common market starts to develop into customs unions and then into the single market of the European Union. Before the Treaty of Rome, in 1951, we also have the ECSC Treaty, okay, and this was seen as the kind of push towards greater integration immediately after the Second World War, and it was, you know, the European Coal and Steel Community Treaty, and it basically envisaged the linking of French and German economies, specifically within the, you know, the industrial output of coal and steel, the coal and steel community. And this treaty created a common market in coal and steel. And it was very interesting that this was a period of time when it was regulated by 4 supranational institutions with decision-making powers. We're going to start to talk about the supranational institutions when we start to look at how these institutions would eventually evolve through treaty law and through European enlargement into the institutions of the European Union that we have today. Things like the European Council, the Parliament, the ECJ, all these kind of things. And the concept of supranational authority is something that was, it's increasingly important in the establishment of the European Union. Because the European Union, the idea is that what we have with these supranational institutions is that member states voluntarily delegate, you know, certain powers to this supranational institution. So we start to see different areas being harmonized across all of the EU member states. Okay, and we're going to start, and we'll look specifically at the idea of harmonization when we look in detail at the EU single market. So the EEC and the Euratom treaties of 1957 was what we just talked about before, the Treaty of Rome. Okay, they built upon this original treaty, the ECSC Treaty, and they extended economic integration beyond coal and steel. So the Coal and Steel Communities Treaty was quite seminal in its ability to create a common market between coal and steel. The EEC Treaty created a customs union by incorporating free movement of goods between member states, and this is very important because it also so I'll talk about free movement of goods in a minute. So this was you know, one point to the EEC Treaty, the Treaty of Rome. What it also managed to do was also establish a single common customs tariff for external goods entering the community. Okay, so not only did it regulate, so let's just, you know, use a very basic diagram. So let's just, you know, EEC. So this is the community. So not only did it regulate the movement of goods from member states within the community, but it also established a common regulation between goods coming in and out of the community around the world. Okay, and the concept of the free movement of goods and the concept of a customs union is very, very, very important within the context of the European Economic Constitution. So the European Economic Constitution. And ultimately, the aim of creating this customs union, the aim of the Treaty of Rome, was to try and achieve an internal market. And again, I'm going to say that we're going to you know, interchangeably use the terms internal market and single market. I'm going to use single market as much as I can because that's the phraseology that I was taught. So we've got single market and internal market, but they effectively mean you know, effectively the same thing. Okay, and so we'll examine the single market in great detail, but for now we should just you know, put down some general basic definitions. So the idea of a single market entails the removal of barriers to trade and establish free movement rights as well as anti-competitive practices. So when we have the single market, what we are trying to aim to do is protect free movement rights. So the free movement of goods, the free movement of people, the free movement of services, and the free movement of capital. Okay, and within that as well, you also, within the context of services, you also have the freedom of establishment in other member states. And this effectively would involve increasing market access between the member states, so that trade can be done frictionless. There'll be frictionless trade between member states. And again, this is all to do with promoting economic integration. Economic integration. We will see in the next lesson, when we start to look at the Single European Act and the Commission's paper on completing the internal market, that ultimately the Europeans' economic constitution, the economic motivations of the European Union, is to create the single market in order to ensure economic integration. So that's what we're going to talk about with the single market. And then also we've got this added economic motivation, which is to not only regulate trade within member states, but also to regulate trade between the community and external states. Okay. And so the founding states of the EEC Treaty also signed the European Atomic Energy Community Treaty, or Euratom Treaty, and this effectively was established to regulate nuclear power between member states. I'm torn between whether or not we're going to examine the Euratom Treaty in very much detail, because it's sort of only tangentially related to European Union law, and it's more its own kind of thing. It's more of a branch of almost nuclear law than it is to do with the European Union specifically. So I'm sure it will come up within the context of at some point. But just to note there that the Euratom Treaty established regulations of nuclear power between member states. So this is really where we see the origins of the European Union. In the next lesson, we're going to see how these foundations started to build into the European Union that we see today, before we start to look at how the European Union creates legislation and how the European Union institutions operate within each other.